Okay, in sections 13, 1, 2, and 3, I've combined them all together because they sort of all flow with one another. So in section 1, we're going to get a basic understanding of what ecology is. So ecologists study environment at different levels of organization, so that's going to be the first thing we're going to look at. Ecology is the study of interactions among living things and between the living things and their surroundings. So living and non-living things, looking at how they end up interacting with one another. An organism, such as in this picture down here, is going to be right here. This alligator is going to be an example of an organism, so an individual living thing. That's the smallest really level of ecology that an ecologist is really going to end up studying, is that. The next level up is a population, which is a group of the same species that lives in one area. So again, in that same picture, we've got a group of alligators, which would represent a population. The next step up from that is the community. A community is a group of different species that live together in one area. So in this example, it would be the alligators, the turtle, the different birds that are there, the fish, all of that would be a community. The level up from that is an ecosystem. It includes all of the organisms as well as the climate, soil, water, rocks, and other non-living things in that area. So it's the biotic and abiotic. So we'll talk about those terms as we go on. So biotic is with life, abiotic is without life. And then the final level, which you could go one more past this, which would be the biosphere, but the largest one that we're going to look at is the biome. And it's a major regional or global community of organisms characterized by the climate conditions and the plant communities that thrive there. So again, we'll go from largest to smallest. It's biome, ecosystem, community, population, and organism is the levels of study or the levels of organization in ecology. So when we talk about ecology, there's different research methods that are going to be used in doing experiments, because you can't really do like a lab experiment and get the results that you want, because you're wanting to see how it works in the environment. So observation, again, is the act of carefully watching something over time. Observations of a population can be done by visual surveys. So that part is the same. You can go out and make observations and see things for what they are. Direct surveys for easy to spot species, you could employ things like binoculars or scopes or things like that. Indirect surveys are used for species that are difficult to track, and it's going to include looking for signs of other signs of presence for them. So it could be like you're looking for a nest or you're looking at tracks. So things like that are going to be what you would end up doing for the indirect surveys. Like I said, experiments are performed in the lab or in the field. Most likely they're going to be done in the lab. So lab experiments give researchers more control. Lab experiments are not reflective of the complex interactions of nature. So the field experiments give you a more accurate picture of what's actually going on. But it may not be easily controlled. So field experiments, like I said, may not help determine the actual cause and effect, because you're not able to control all of the different variables in the experiment. So another thing that you can do is you can do computer and mathematical models like we talked about in the last chapter, and they can be used to describe model in nature. So modeling allows scientists to learn about organisms or ecosystems in a way that would not be possible in a natural or a lab setting. So it's just things like maybe ethics come into play like we talked about, or it's just too difficult, takes too long, so you would end up doing a model for that. So this should actually say Section 2. With Section 2, every ecosystem includes both living and non-living factors, like I mentioned before. So an ecosystem includes both biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic factors are the living things. So anything that's alive, like we talked about in the last chapter, the characteristics that make something alive, that is a biotic factor. Plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, all of those things would be considered a living thing in an environment. Abiotic factors are things that are non-living. So you'd have things like moisture, temperature, wind, sunlight, soil. Uh, all of those things are going to end up being considered abiotic. Anything that's not alive would fall into that category. So when we change one factor in ecosystem, it may affect other factors in that ecosystem as well. So biodiversity is the assortment or variety of all living things in an ecosystem. So it's a wide variety of things that you find there that are alive. Rainforests, for example, have a ton of biodiversity, more than other locations in the world, but are threatened by human activities. Same thing if you're looking at oceans. Coral reefs are considered the rainforests of the ocean in that they have a lot of life and things, and they're easily affected by human activities. So another thing that will come into play is what's known as a keystone species. And in a game that we'll play in a few days, a keystone species is a species that has an unusually large effect on its ecosystem. So in that game we play, there's going to be one that's a keystone species that's there. So this right here is an arch, and the keystone is that middle stone in the arch. And if you remove that middle stone, that whole arch is going to collapse. And it's the same thing that would happen with keystone species. So keystone species form and maintain a complex web of life. So in this example right here, the beavers are an example of a keystone species. When they make a dam, that builds water up, which allows different animals to be able to live there, gives nesting areas for animals. There's another one where it was a good example of a keystone species that was removed, and that was a giant sea otter were hunted in the Pacific Northwest to the where they basically wiped out that population. Well, those sea otters fed on sea urchins, and the sea urchins fed on the roots of the kelp. And that kelp forest had a lot of biodiversity there. Well, when the sea otters were gone, the sea urchins ended up eating all the roots of the kelp forest went away, and all life disappeared from that area until they were able to reintroduce the uh, the giant sea otters to that area. So in section 3, life in an ecosystem is going to require sources of energy. So producers, they're going to provide energy for other organisms in the ecosystem. So another name for a producer is what is known as an autotroph. So producers get their energy from non-living resources. Producers, like I said, are also called autotrophs because they make their own food. Now, I know many of you might be like, well, I make my sandwich every day. Yeah, no, not the same thing. It means, can you go out in the sun and absorb the sun's energy and make food from it? No, you cannot. So that is what producers are able to do. So consumers, that is what we are. Consumers are organisms that get their energy by eating other living things, one or a living resource. So you've got all different types of consumers. You've got carnivores, herbivores, omnivores, detrivores. All of those things are going to be mentioned in future sections of this chapter. So that is what we end up having. So another name for a consumer is a heterotroph because they feed off of other things in order to get their energy. So we are consumers or heterotrophs. So almost all producers obtain their energy from sunlight. So that process is called photosynthesis. So photosynthesis and most producers use sunlight as the energy source. There's another type of energy source, and that's chemosynthesis, in which a prokaryote, so a bacteria, is going to take chemicals from their environment and turn those into an energy source. So that ends the notes for sections 1, 2, and 3.